Just finished recording a reading of a letter that I had sent to Biden-Harris administration after the Russia-Ukraine war started. Now, I'm going to show what I wrote after the Israel-Palestine conflict started. I sent this to the president and vice president. They set a cap of 2,000 characters max for letters that could be sent through their system, so I had to break it down into 66 parts. I posted all this at single time at the same day that I sent it to the Biden-Harris administration. And hopefully this will help give a clearer perspective of what's really going on and why things have been happening the way they have. So, in March 2022, I sent you a strategy for the Russia-Ukraine war, mainly to trade the territory Putin wanted independent for Taiwan independence. You haven't followed it. My predictions and assessment on the conflict were almost 100% correct. I did say that it looked like China may prefer to not take Taiwan by force and that they were dangling a deal for Taiwan independence in front of us, which may not have been totally correct. It only looked like that to me because I'm too good at assessing critical diplomatic situations. You people in the Biden-Harris administration are not very good at this. They expected your nonsensical knee-jerk reactions, played you, and are expecting the fallout to help Trump get reelected. If Trump wins the next election, he is going to give Russia a pass and help China retake Taiwan. That was closer to their plan. You decided to pressure Russia. That pressure cannot be discounted completely, but it wasn't enough. Like I said, it wouldn't be. And now they have opened a second front against you, us. Again, with this newer Israel-Hamas conflict, you are being played and manipulated. I'm going to try explaining the updated situation. I will include some of what has already happened, what is happening, and what will likely happen. Then what I suggest is the best or better ways to handle these situations together. Specifically, the best decision to make is to unrecognize Israel, but I'm going to have to explain some background on realities you may or may not be aware of. Also, I concluded by the time I finished this that you guys really need to bring me into your team. Your words, actions, and policies are all over the place. There are things you don't understand, and you clearly don't have a coherent strategy. So they obviously didn't do that. I have actually applied to, I think, Harris's campaign, but she hasn't hired me. So whether they even got this or read this at all or took this serious at all, I think there are some indications that they got it, but obviously it's pretty radical. A big part of the argument that I make is unrecognizing Israel, which for a politician, especially a United States politician, will be very difficult or almost impossible to do at this point. So part of the reason why I said that was, okay, fine, like if you're not going to unrecognize Israel, there's still things that you have to take into account, take into consideration. A lot of people do think that Israel should be unrecognized, or at least really what it means is there should be a one-state solution. Not necessarily that Jews or Israelis should be kicked out of the region, but the two-state solution is a bad idea. It's not a good solution. And ultimately, the most ideal solution would obviously be to have a one-state solution. It's much better than having ethnically separated countries into all their own ethnic parties or religious groups, and then just allowing conflict to precipitate out of that. You are aware that Benjamin Netanyahu and other right-wing Israeli leaders spent years or decades propping up Hamas. The intent was to use Hamas's aggressive and violent rhetoric and actions as excuses to prevent a peace process and a bid for Palestinian statehood being successful. I could tell this was Netanyahu's strategy back in 2012. The first YouTube video I ever made was on exactly that. In September 2011, Mahmoud Abbas had made a bid for Palestinian statehood at the UN. He's the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization that is mostly quartered in the West Bank. 3 weeks later, October 11th, Netanyahu made a deal with Hamas to trade 1,027 Palestinian prisoners for one Israeli soldier who had been captured for 5 years by then. The timing of the deal was very suspicious. If Israel was really interested in a peaceful settlement, why would they hand the extremist and violent Palestinian Hamas group a big victory? Because it made sense as a strategy. Me quoting myself in my 2012 video at 6 minutes. It was clear Netanyahu wanted to give the extremists in Gaza a victory, both to redirect Palestinian support away from a peaceful strategy to continue the violent strategy, and also to redirect media attention away from Abbas's heroism from the peaceful bid. This was the first incident that made me suspect Netanyahu's administration was deliberately trying to maintain a level of a threat to Israel, or at least the perception of the threat. So, I don't know if these links... No, it just goes to intercept. So I have the title. You can basically, if you want to look these up, copy it, paste it. Before they vowed to annihilate Hamas, Israeli officials considered it an asset. I guess this is blocked behind a paywall. For years, Netanyahu let's see if this one goes through. For years, Netanyahu propped up Hamas, now it's blown up in our faces. So a lot of there's a few different articles that go into how Netanyahu was supporting Hamas. He directly funneled them payments. There's even, I think it's even considered that Israel created Hamas or helped create Hamas back a few decades ago or before this. And since then, Netanyahu was very deliberately supporting them and considering them an asset. Far-right MK Bezalel Smotrich, now the finance minister of the hardline government and leader of the rich, said so himself in 2015. According to various reports, Netanyahu made a similar report at Likud faction meeting party early in 2019. He was quoted as saying that those who oppose a Palestinian state should support the transfer of funds to Gaza because maintaining the separation between the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza would prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. While he doesn't not make these kind of statements publicly or officially, his words are in line with the policy he implemented. There was one. I think I reference it later. But this was my video. So if you want to hear what I said, just like a short clip of what I said about it. I said, hello everyone, this is my first video and I'm making it in this channel because I knew that was coming. Then the idea that their bargaining power would be lessened anytime soon seemed to be kind of baseless. So to me it was clear that Netanyahu actually wanted to give the Palestinians or the extremists in Gaza a victory, both to redirect Palestinian support away from a peaceful resolution strategy to maybe continue the violent strategy, and also to redirect media attention away from Abbas's new heroism for the PLO, the peaceful bid. And so I'll go, as I keep reading, I'll go into it. You can watch it. That was my young college self, basically doing this for practice and because I thought I saw something strange going on. It was when I was a student for international security and conflict resolution. So, next part. Several secondary sources reported Netanyahu said in 2019, anyone who wants to thwart establishment of a Palestinian state has to support bolstering Hamas and transferring money. We read that. In a 2015 interview, Israel's finance minister Bezalel Smotrich said, quote, in this game of delegitimization, the Palestinian Authority is a burden. Hamas is an asset. It's a terrorist organization. No one will recognize it. No one will give it status at the ICC. No one will let it put forth a resolution at the UN Security Council. Then, would we need an American veto or would we not need an American veto? Given that the main game, the central court where we play now, is the international delegitimization, Hamas, at this point, in my opinion, will be an asset. I don't think we need to worry about Hamas. So, this is the video of him actually saying it.
נכס, באותו מגרש בינלאומי. במשחק הזה של הדלגיטימציה, תחשבו על זה לרגע, הרשות הפלסטינית היא נטל וחמאס הוא נכס. הוא ארגון טרור, אף אחד לא יכיר בו, אף אחד לא ייתן לו מעמד ב-ICC. אף אחד לא ייתן לו להוביל החלטה במועצת הביטחון, ואז נצטרך וטו אמריקאי או לא נצטרך וטו אמריקאי. אני לא בטוח שלנו היום, שוב, בהינתן שהמשחק המרכזי, המגרש המרכזי שבו אנחנו משחקים עכשיו הוא הדה-לגיטימציה הבינלאומית, שם אבו מאזן מפיל לנו חללים משמעותיים, וחמאס בנקודה הזאת לפי דעתי יהיה נכס. אני לא חושב שאני צריך לחשוש מזה.
So that's a caption of their strategy, that it's beneficial to them for PR reasons and manipulation reasons for such a focus to be put on the extremists. And so if they support the extremists and reinforce their perpetuation, then they would have a perpetual excuse to implement whatever policies and get whatever support that they're trying to get. So Netanyahu was very easy to read for me back in 2012. He was purposefully propping up Hamas, a terrorist group, so that he could use them as a justification for implementing his policies and rejecting any international pressure. When I made my video in April 2012, at the time, Netanyahu's more recent shtick was to constantly harp on Iran's nuclear program and continuously threaten to bomb them because supposedly there was an imminent threat Iran was about to develop a nuclear weapon. It looked very analogous to his support of Hamas, or more precisely, Hamas's support of Israel, specifically Netanyahu and the Likud. At the time, threatening Likud is Netanyahu's party, more right-wing party. At the time, threatening to bomb Iran was very helpful for maintaining the theocratic Iranian regime after the Arab Spring. In early 2011, the Arab Spring had begun with Tunisia and then Egypt, but really the Arab Spring did not start with the Arabs in 2011. It began with Iran in 2009. Their Green Movement was the first major challenge to the legitimacy of the government of a Muslim-majority country, I believe since the Islamic Revolution that led to Iran's current form of government itself in 1979. It began as protests to the probability their June 2009 presidential elections were rigged or fraudulent, but over the next decade would develop into protests against the supreme leader and the theocratic cronyism form of government itself. The Iranians did hold a number of protests during the Arab Spring period until early 2012, but their government took more steps to suppress them this time around. They killed more people and arrested several of the leaders of the opposition parties from the 2009 elections. The protests or revolts were successful in several of the Arab countries. Ben Ali in Tunisia, Gaddafi in Libya, Mubarak in Egypt, Saleh in Yemen were all deposed, all of them in 2011, up until Saleh in February 2012. Then something happened. Iran's protests continued into February 2012, but stopped all of a sudden. Can you guess what happened? That's when Benny Boy Yahoo started touting Iran's nuclear weapons program and threatening to bomb them for it. Yes, he had been using Iran as an existential threat for more than a decade by then, but at this point in time, February 2012, he really started ramping it up. So, Iran's protests continued until February 2012 exactly. That was when the Arab Spring ended exactly, and that was exactly when Netanyahu really started talking about Iran's nuclear program and threatening to physically bomb them. You can look those up. Netanyahu threatening to bomb Iran in 2012 was why the protests in Iran and other Muslim countries that had not yet been overthrown during the Arab Spring quickly grinded to a halt. Israel was threatening to bomb one of them. The insinuation that they did not have the right to hold nuclear weapons was insulting enough by itself. Through the rest of the year, Netanyahu constantly claimed Iran was very close, within a year of obtaining enough enriched uranium for a bomb. Back in early 2012, I was seeing this happen in real time. I was in college majoring in international security and wondered why conflicts like these were continuing. Initially, I thought it was the Muslims who wanted to inflict their delusions on as many people as they could. While that is certainly true to an extent, I also began to see that there were many individual interests and actors at play, and that a new meta of threats, accusations, and value warping had made its way onto the stage. Broadly, this meta is within the arena of the justification wars, when people vie to focus others' attention and willpower on something or away from something. Today, the most reliable way is to make an accusation of aggressive violence or potential violence outside of self-defense, because that's considered the most bad thing, because people are pansies. The second most reliable way to focus others' attention seems to be sexual harassment or rape, because people are squeamish. Then there's all other kinds of conflict. Then these justification wars permeate down to more basic matters like determining what the law, tax rates, spending rates, etc. should be. The quote I referenced by Israel's Bezalel Smotrich when he said, "The main game where we play now is international delegitimization," is an example of one aspect of these justification wars. Now, if you are actually a malicious person and you want to hurt someone just because you feel insulted or whatever, instead of having to take the risk of hurting them yourself, which you can get in trouble for, you can accuse them of doing or planning something very, very naughty and maybe have others hurt or restrain them for you. If you are a greedy person and you want to get away with as much as you can, instead of having to defend yourself, you can try to justify it or redirect attention by accusing someone else of acting improperly and waste their time by putting them on the back foot so you don't have to do so yourself. Was there any evidence of Netanyahu's nuclear threat harping? I don't know. Was there? Our own government didn't seem to think so. Mossad didn't seem to think so either. And there is a link. Claim contradicted by Mossad. CBS News. You can look that up. But here's the thing. Timing. If Iran really was about to achieve nuclear weapons in the current... Now, this was a question I was writing to obviously Biden and Harris. So I was asking them, was there a reason to believe that they were actually really that close to achieving nuclear weapons? Because recently, what's his name? Our Secretary of State, Blinken, he said months ago that Iran was just a week or two away from having a nuclear bomb, or at least enough enriched uranium to create a nuclear bomb. And it's been months since then, and Iran still hasn't gotten a nuclear bomb. So, are they just bullshitting us? Are they just making shit up still? Or do they actually know better? Can they know better? So I was just basically asking them. It doesn't even seem like our own government can at least say whether or not they know what the reality is. I don't know, can they say even what the reality is? So the only way we'd be able to achieve... Okay, hang on. Here's the thing, timing. If Iran really was about to achieve nuclear weapons, in the current international context, there's almost no way we, the U.S., would be able to justify attacking Iran ourselves. We've had our own mistakes. Our previous wars, then current, didn't turn out so well. Specifically pertaining to Iran, we had backed their overthrown monarch, whose son now lives with us, apparently. The only way we would be able to achieve an Iranian regime change more favorable to us, our values, our interests, including non-proliferation, is if the Iranian people do it themselves. The greatest real threat to the Iranian regime is their own people. The Arab Spring made that very clear. But if Iran's regime was overthrown, then Benny Boy Yahoo would lose his existential threat. Iran was not just a potential nuclear threat, but a supporter of international terrorist groups, including Hamas. We know that by then, Ben and other Likud knew the value of a terrorist threat for themselves. The existence of these existential threats delegitimized criticism of Israel and conversely legitimized their actions. To this end, Netanyahu had welcomed the gift of funding Hamas from Iran and decided to return the favor. Eventually, he reciprocated because he's such a thoughtful guy and began giving the Iranian regime their own existential threat so that their people would not overthrow them. That is why Netanyahu began harping about Iran's nuclear program so much all of a sudden and threatening to bomb them in February 2012. Does any other reason make sense? No. There was suddenly considerable proof that the people of a majority Muslim countries could overthrow their own problematic regimes. Given that there was no way we were going to actually invade Iran at any point in the future, if Netanyahu was actually really concerned about Iran's potential threat, he would have allowed or even encouraged a civilian overthrow of the regime. Instead, his actions halted the Arab Spring's return to its origin in Iran. At the time, the outcome of the regimes overthrown during the Arab Spring was unclear. There was considerable worry that what might replace them would be even more radical, fundamentalist, and difficult to control. With Iran, however, that wasn't the case. Reza Shah had modernized the economy and culture to be more liberal like the West, to the dismay of the Muslim clerics who eventually overthrew him. But many Iranians still had experience of Western ideals and culture, plus the internet, which the Iranian regime would suppress much of in the successive decade. Iranians from 2009 until now have been considerably more amicable to the West than other Islamic Middle East populations. Leaders of the 2009 Green Movement, like Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi, under house arrest since 2011, would have organized a reformation of the government if there was another counter-revolution. Their ideals were focused on anti-corruption, anti-cronyism, and the well-being of the Iranian people. The other countries' revolutions have been not great. Libya appears to be a failed state with several factions, including ISIL, controlling different regions. Egypt is nominally democratic, but is mostly in control of a president with uncontested powers in Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Tunisia is similarly run by a president with consolidated power after he disbanded parliament and fired the prime minister. Yemen had formed a government eventually, but broke out into a civil war when Islamic Houthis rejected it. With the recent deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, Yemen seems to be stabilizing now. Syria broke out into a civil war between Assad and several rebel groups. ISIL took over considerable portions of Iraq, and some other countries declared themselves a new caliphate, which was rejected by all of the Muslim countries, and injected themselves into Syria to fight both sides. Netanyahu's bullshit continued for the next decade. The Obama and European administrations pushed for a nuclear non-proliferation deal with Iran and eventually got it in 2015 with solid verification of compliance in exchange for payments over time. Netanyahu loudly protested it all the while. He just said that he didn't want Iran to be given money because if they decided to pick up nuclear development later on, they would have more money to do the thing they said they weren't going to do. But he didn't have an alternative proposal to address this imminent threat in a definitive way. His strategy then seemed to just be to constantly threaten to bomb or sabotage or assassinate Iranian military and nuclear specialists indefinitely. He was still saying, just a few weeks before October 7th Hamas attack, that Iran must face a credible nuclear threat. I gotta play this.
Amazon early holiday deals are here.
Woo! Show the curse, a great curse, the curse of a nuclear Iran. But today I bring least between Israel that connect to change. But I also believe that we must not give the Palestinians a veto over new peace treaties with Arab states. Sanctions must be snapped back. And above all, Iran must face a credible nuclear threat.
So he's directly saying that Iran should consider being nuked, that he is actually threatening Iran with nukes. Now, given maybe certain conditions, but he touts this shit constantly. But he thinks that Iran shouldn't be able to get a nuclear nukes themselves. I mean, you could say that it's a double standard, but the only defense to a nuclear threat is nuclear threat. All right, well, I'll just continue reading because I say all this stuff eventually. Oh, right here. So Iran must face. He was still saying just a few weeks ago that Iran must face a credible nuclear threat. So Iran must face a nuclear threat, but Israel must not. Everyone in the world faces a credible nuclear threat. That's how deterrence works. That's what it is. The only reason he said it, again, is to use Iran as the boogeyman to frame a justification for his policies and to help those in control of Iran maintain their power to give him that boogeyman. The only counter to a nuclear threat is a nuclear threat. How is threatening to nuke Iran supposed to get them to not pursue nuclear weapons? It doesn't. It convinces Iranians to want nukes more. Obama's non-proliferation deal with Iran was successful. Iran was in full compliance until retard Trump decided to listen to retard Netanyahu and withdrew from the deal. Before the nuclear deal came up for renewal, I gotta say for a second, I was swearing constantly in my first few iterations of this, like many, many, many times. I'm only 11 out of 66. I had to remove like 95% of them, but I decided to keep obviously some of them in for emphasis on certain points. Before the nuclear deal came up for renewal under Trump, Netanyahu's Mossad broke into a warehouse in Iran and made out with piles of folders and CDs with documentation of Iran's old nuclear work. He put the information into presentation and claimed it was proof that Iran could not be trusted to continue. Netanyahu tried making it sound like Iran keeping their data meant they were planning on continuing their nuclear weapons work in the future, but the documentation they found was archived and locked away, indistinguishable from what the Iranians would have done if they were intending to comply with a non-proliferation deal. Did Netanyahu expect them to destroy all their work? They kept a bunch of photos and data of their work. Why would they want to destroy it? It was their work. It wasn't in the deal for them to destroy all their information. And if they wanted to or needed to restart the program later on, if the non-proliferation deal fell apart, they would have wanted it. The deal itself was not something permanent. It was due for renewal only 3 years after it was signed. Maybe if it was a permanent deal lasting several decades, you could have expected them to destroy all they had. Oh, I know. Maybe the Iranians were actually prophets. Maybe they had a crystal ball and could see in the future that one day, someday, some shithead was going to run his retard mouth and threaten to nuke them repetitively. The renewal date for the non-proliferation deal with Iran had arrived in May 2018. Retard number 2 decided to act like he was persuaded by Netanyahu's farce and unilaterally withdrew from the deal. Trump made many treasonous decisions during his presidency. More precisely, Trump made so many decisions with little to no explanation other than him being manipulated by foreign interests that it is impossibly unlikely he wasn't corrupted. Starting with this example, Trump had zero reason to withdraw from the deal other than Netanyahu wanted him to. It was working, the cost was outweighed by our interest in making the region more stable. It removed Netanyahu's excuse to keep threatening Iran so that the more secular will of the people in Islamic countries could start to take precedence over fundamentalism. There was a pattern to Trump's corruption. I'm going to list and try to explain some of the more grievous examples. This list is not exhaustive. I was not paying attention during most of Trump's presidency. For sure, I missed some. The last will bring us back to Netanyahu and Iran. Number 1, Trump misdirected and covered up for Mohammed bin Salman's probabilistically certain ordering of Jamal Khashoggi's assassination. The Biden administration's report assessing the Saudi government's role in the killing of Jamal Khashoggi was surprisingly short, but well done. I'm sure if there was some kind of trial and many more details, evidence, and reasoning could be given. Number 2, Trump's abrupt withdrawal of troops from Syria, abandoning the Kurds, our allies, on and off for decades, more recently fought with the U.S. against ISIS, holding thousands of prisoners at the time, who mostly escaped afterwards, was an extreme betrayal. He reportedly did so after a call with Erdogan in Turkey, with, again, no rationality or reasons behind the decision. Number 3, the tariffs Trump created were designed to hurt the U.S. and help Russia and China. The first tariffs were imposed on washing machines. New washing machines are significantly more water and energy efficient than ones made a few decades before. Tariffing them at first looks like a racist jab at Asians, because Asians disproportionately own laundromats in the U.S., but they are actually crucial pieces of household infrastructure that reduce natural resource consumption. Steel and aluminum tariffs are an extremely stupid idea. Think about what the whole reason for imperialism is. It's to make the acquisition of goods, especially raw materials, cheaper for manufacturers and consumers in the empire's country. If you really wanted to prevent businesses and jobs from going overseas, why would you make the raw materials required for manufacturers to produce in your own country even more expensive for them? I was in the process of designing and building a prototype contraption in 2020. Within only about a year, I'm pretty sure the store price of steel and aluminum had gone up almost 40%. The last time I checked, the price of steel at my local hardware store had skyrocketed even more to almost double the price when I first began looking. Tariffing raw materials punishes our manufacturers and incentivizes them to take their business abroad. Plus, basic economics. If we aren't buying as much global steel and aluminum because it costs us more, it lowers the global demand, reducing the price for other countries. Steel and aluminum are particularly universal in just about all heavy military equipment. Our tariffs on the materials only make them cheaper for Russia, China, Iran, etc.'s military weapons manufacturers. According to this Reuters article, China actually does the opposite. They put export tariffs on aluminum, so it's more available and cheaper for their manufacturers. When I found this, that was pretty amazing. How fucking stupid that bastard is, fucking Trump. In an interview with MSNBC earlier this year, Trump randomly said, I made a great deal with China. I've never tried it. I've actually never tried an impersonation. I made a great deal with China. One of the greatest dairy deals ever made for the farmers and the manufacturers, $15 billion a year. It was a great deal. I don't even talk about it because once COVID hit, I was like, I don't even want to talk about anything. The deal Trump was referring to occurred a few years after the tariff trade war he started. In the deal, the average tariff on China imports to U.S. dropped from 21% to 19.3%. All of that came from a tariff reduction on consumer goods such as clothing and sports equipment. In other words, in this great deal, Trump reduced tariffs only on useless shit that doesn't benefit our economy or military at all. China promised to make $200 billion worth of purchases from the U.S., but the consensus appears to be that those extra purchases never happened. Probably why he doesn't like talking about it. When Trump said he got the farmers and manufacturers paid, he may be referring to how we had to bail them out for tens of billions of dollars because they lost access to China's markets they were expecting to sell to. I remember when the tariffs went into effect, the store price of cherries plummeted to 30 cents per pound, when normally they were $3 to $4 per pound. When Trump says he got them paid, they were already getting paid by China. That's why they were exporting their products. When Trump gave the impression that he was imposing tariffs to support American businesses and punish China, how was that supposed to work? China is not completely communist. They still need to be mostly capitalistic to function because one central government can't control everything efficiently. They have business people and economic interests that are not automatically in line with the CCP's interests. The tariffs Trump created allowed the Chinese government to pay those business interests less for the steel and aluminum they needed for their military and economic growth. In retaliation to Trump's original tariffs, China imposed tariffs on agricultural products like tobacco, alcohol, processed foods, some meats and fish, and vehicles. In other words, China put tariffs on what they don't need, can make themselves, or get elsewhere cheaper. What Trump said in that MSNBC interview highlights his ability to insist his America sabotaging ideas are actually great ideas, when I say ability, I just mean his lack of compunction. Trump's America sabotaging maneuvers are not accidental. His tariffs on extremely important and essential goods and raw materials hurt our manufacturers and resource management. He only reduced tariffs on useless shit, goods not considered investments towards future economic growth. China did the opposite. They put tariffs on fruit, peanut butter, orange juice, and soybeans, products that are either easy to miss or harmful for human health, and actually put export tariffs on materials they need for economic and military growth. All the while, Trump pretended like he was being tough on China when he was actually helping them by reducing the cost of metals and infrastructures for them and gave them excuses to implement policies they wanted to. Number 4, Trump approved of China taking full control of Hong Kong. Congress passed the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, which Trump signed in July 14, 2020. The HKAA provides for mandatory sanctions against individuals, entities, and financial institutions in response to China's national security law for Hong Kong. At the same time, Trump made an executive order on Hong Kong's normalization, revoking all special treatment for Hong Kong and its residents and treating them as the same as China, including ordering all goods made in Hong Kong labeled as Made in China. Both actions were taken in response to China passing a new national security law for Hong Kong the previous month. I have some questions. How is treating Hong Kong like China not what the CCP wants, the Chinese Communist Party? Assuming treating Hong Kong like China was punishment, why would we want to punish the people of Hong Kong for the CCP's actions? Why was Congress's Autonomy Act not enough? It was tailored to specifically punish via sanctions individuals and entities who were directly responsible for limiting Hong Kong's autonomy in violation of the joint declaration between Britain and China. How does labeling goods made in Hong Kong labeled Made in China help the people of Hong Kong and punish China? Taking away credibility for someone's work and giving it to someone else sounds like a pathetic thing to do. How are consumers supposed to support Hong Kong by favoring their products now? I get limiting weapon sales to Hong Kong now that China's security forces are controlling it more, but were there really licenses given to Hong Kong that were so sensitive yet didn't worry us that China would act inappropriately with them that we are now suddenly worried they may? Treating Hong Kong as China is a gift to China. Congress authorized punishing the CCP for their actions, not rewarding them. Recognizing Hong Kong as part of China looks worse than what the CCP was doing. The protests in Hong Kong were triggered by a proposed law to extradite to mainland China. One of the CCP's prerogatives is to suppress criticism of themselves and the country. There was worry extradition would be abused to suppress dissent in Hong Kong, among other things. Treating Hong Kong as China and labeling their goods as made in China effectively takes China's side and removes ways to support the Hong Kong people. The extradition law was not passed. Instead, China passed a national security law for Hong Kong in June 2020. Technically allowed under the handover agreement, but appears to be used to suppress dissent and violate the agreed basic law protecting freedom of speech, assembly, and independent judiciary. Later, in 2022, China also limited the number of seats in Hong Kong's legislative council that could be voted on by the public and began screening the remaining candidates for eligibility based on patriotism. Trump's additional Hong Kong normalization executive order, additional Hong Kong normalization executive order did nothing to counter the new Hong Kong national security law. There were no demands, no out or way to improve given to China that could make the situation more favorable for the Hong Kong people and adherence to the handover agreement. It automatically concluded the situation in China's favor for no reason. Congress's Hong Kong Autonomy Act hadn't had any time yet to apply the pressure it was meant to. Even the names of the policies were contradictory to each other. Congress was focused on preserving Hong Kong's autonomy, while Trump's order helped normalize the new situation of Hong Kong being under China's new national security law. I understand it is impossible to force China to more respect Hong Kong's autonomy. The only possible legitimate reason I can see for the normalization order is worry that Chinese security forces will break into businesses and or force them to hand over sensitive information like intellectual property or private data. However, on its face, China's Hong Kong Security Act was not business-related. Trump's executive order also effectively limited immigration from Hong Kong to the U.S., while Boris Johnson in the UK did the opposite and gave Hong Kong citizens a path to British citizenship. Apparently, China puts great effort into punishing expatriates and forcing them to return, snaring over 10,000 since 2014, according to Safeguard Defender's report. Trump limiting immigration from Hong Kong helped China do China's work for them. Trump could never actually bring himself to say anything in support of the protesters that wasn't super vague and could be easily interpreted as support of Xi Jinping and the CCP's China and not the protesters. The reason why I went on so much about Trump's tariffs and the way he handled Hong Kong is because they are very clear examples of Trump pretending like he is being tough on China while actually helping them. And that brings us back to Iran. The assassination of Qasem Soleimani by airstrike was another unilateral decision Trump abruptly made with virtually no justification on January 3, 2020. A handful of Iraqis were also killed in the airstrike. The effect of the assassination gave Iran a martyr and a reason for the people to take to the streets shouting death to America instead of continuing protests against the Iranian regime. On the previous November 15, 2019, Iran's government had announced gasoline price hikes. What followed in the next week was massive protests across the country. The regime responded to the initial protests with harsh crackdowns, killing more than 100 protesters in just a few days, with the total number possibly being more than 1,000 in less than a week. Meanwhile, the government implemented an almost complete blackout of internet access across the country for 2 weeks. There had been strikes and protests intermittently in 2018 and earlier in 2019, but most perspectives I have seen regarding this November 2019 period as the most energized and anti-government protest and violent suppression since the 1979 Iranic Islamic Revolution. Soleimani's assassination happened 1.5 months after the initial mass wave of protests was finally suppressed. After his assassination, several cities' streets were filled with tens of thousands of people rallying with "Death to America, Israel" chants. So many Iranians showed up for his funeral that at least 50 of them died, crushed by the crowd in an enclosed space. The regime's clerics used the assassination as a buffer for themselves, naming Soleimani a martyr. Every year thereafter, his anniversary has been used as a rallying call for vengeance across several Middle Eastern countries. On January 8th, 2020, Iran launched missiles at al-Assad base in Iraq, injuring more than 20 troops. I've heard up to 100 troops were injured. Later that night, Iran shot down a Ukrainian airliner headed toward Iran. They blamed it on human error and being on high alert after launching rockets at al-Assad. At first, Iran denied responsibility. They admitted their mistake eventually, but said the plane had gone off course. They only made the admission after Western countries presented evidence that the plane had been shot down by a missile and had not deviated from its flight plan. After the admission, Iranians once again erupted into the streets, protesting the regime for several days. The regime attempted to redirect the ire of people towards the U.S. and Israel, but the people weren't having it. They deliberately avoided U.S. and Israel flags painted on the streets, refusing to step on them. They reiterated that they understood the regime was chronically lying to them. According to CNN, after the initial wave of the November 2019 protests, Hossein Mousavi, the main leader of the initial Green Movement in 2009, who is still under house arrest, said whining and tapping into global war is not a convincing response to the people, and these illusions cannot heal the deep and dangerous wounds inflicted. At least some of the Iranians were able to see through the regime using our bullshit to deflect criticism from their bullshit. These are examples that if Iranians were able to overthrow the regime, they are capable enough to not let it be replaced by another regime or failed state based on bullshit. Recently, on a plane, I spoke with a gorgeous, badass Iranian-American girl who had participated in the 2022 Iran protests that followed the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody. She confirmed to me that more Iranians than ever are aware their regime is full of shit and frequently attempts to manipulate the people. All of these instances of shit decisions by Trump and Netanyahu towards Hamas, Iran, and China show a pattern to their actions where they claim to be hindering these adversaries and competitors, but the real results are actually helping them. Have Trump and Netanyahu been helping Hamas, Iran, China regimes on purpose? Have they intentionally, negligently, or haphazardly harmed our goals and interests simultaneously? Netanyahu and his finance minister Smotrich admitted on their own they were helping prop up Hamas by facilitating payments towards the group in order to prevent Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank from coordinating. It was obvious in 2011 that trading 1,000 Palestinian prisoners for one Israeli soldier was intended to give Hamas a victory as opposed to Abbas and the PLO after their bid for Palestinian statehood. Has Hamas ever executed an Israeli prisoner? I haven't been able to find an instance. Trading 1,000 for one prisoner looks like a very stupid thing to do. What was the rush? Netanyahu said he did it because they would not have gotten a better chance. Really, I watched Mossab Hassan Yousaf's speech at the UN recently. He claimed that one of the 1,000 prisoners was the mastermind of the October 7th attack. I assume he was referring to Yahya Sinwar. That could have been foreseen. Actually, I did foresee it. In my 2012 video I said about the prisoner swap, quote, "This was the first incident that made me suspect Netanyahu was deliberately trying to maintain a threat to Israel, or at least a perception of the threat. It didn't make any sense for the deal to happen then. At the time, Hamas had to move their base out of Syria because they were opposed to Assad's crackdown of the protests against his regime that were parallel to the Arab Spring, not just the protests, but the revolt against his regime. Israel's Iron Dome had just come online in 2011, which made them nearly impervious to Hamas rocket fire. There was no indication Israel's bargaining power with Hamas was going to weaken anytime soon. When Netanyahu single-handedly prevented the Arab Spring from returning to Iran by giving their regime an existential threat by constantly threatening to bomb them, I really wanted to beat the fucking shit out of him just for that. 2012 had the best chance there has ever been to remove or reform the Islamic cleric and the IRGC control of Iran, and Netanyahu single-handedly fucked it up. The IRGC is their Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. It's a lot of accusations that they've been taking control of the economy and have a huge grip on the country. Continuing, you should have wanted to beat the shit out of him for that. Iran is undoubtedly a significant problem. It is not in our interests as a secular, ideally anti-corruption society to allow any fundamentalist theocratic regime to gain too much power, entrench themselves, or spread. As far as I've heard, Iran not only funds international terrorism and violates human rights, but also is a cesspit of corruption with the clerics, IRGC, and cronies controlling up to a majority of the country's entire economy. The Arab Spring that could have taken them out ended exactly in February 2012 when Netanyahu began harping on their nuclear program and threatening to bomb them. Since 2012, Iran's regime branches have only strengthened their grip on the country, making revolutionary reform increasingly more difficult. Given that we are never going to invade Iran in the foreseeable future, the only way to change their government is through their own people. And their own people can only build enough pressure on their government necessary for change when their international threats are cooled. I am probably repeating myself some now, but this is not deniable. I dare anyone to come up with a reason Netanyahu would not have known this. Netanyahu helped secure the Iranian regime on purpose. Netanyahu got Trump to withdraw from the Iranian nuclear deal. You guys created the original nuclear deal for reasons, I assume, like ensuring Israel's safety, eliminating Netanyahu's ability to harp on about Iran's nuclear program so that he couldn't keep openly threatening them and general nonproliferation. I don't know why you haven't reinstated it. As far as I've heard, Iran would welcome a new deal. Do they no longer have a realistic capacity to develop nukes? Do we have the capacity to stop them even if they tried? Did you realize you were being blackmailed? Do you understand or suspect a collusion between Israel's and Iran's government? Did Russia's war with Ukraine change the equation? Are you being manipulated by Netanyahu? I don't have access to what you guys know and have done, so I can't completely assess how good or bad it was for Trump to withdraw from the deal. I do know that at the time of the withdrawal, Netanyahu and Trump's only argument was that they didn't think Iran should be receiving extra money because they fund terrorism. I think the deal was obviously not meant to last indefinitely. It clearly would have been a bad idea to let Iran perpetually blackmail us. The agreement's function and purpose was to be a stepping stone towards a more robust solution to Iran-Israel conflict. The problem was and has been that neither Trump nor Netanyahu have done anything else to move towards a solution when they withdrew from the deal. Netanyahu still thinks he can wantonly threaten Iran with nukes. The fact that Netanyahu's accusation Iran planned to continue developing nukes despite the deal was baseless, plus the fact that Trump and Netanyahu's opinion was to withdraw from the deal without offering an alternative proposal made their policies look no different from intending to sabotage any move towards an amicable resolution just because maintaining Iran as an existential threat to Israel, just like Hamas, is beneficial to Netanyahu's goals. Then, Soleimani's assassination helped protect Iran's regime. A former Israeli intel chief claimed they had supplied intelligence for Soleimani's assassination. I haven't seen the intelligence, so I can't completely say how unnecessary the attack was. General Mark Milley said, quote, "I'll stand by the intelligence I saw that was compelling, it was imminent, and it was very, very clear in scale of scope." Based on some of Milley's comments on the Ukraine-Russia war, I don't think he's very good at assessing international military situations very well. Mike Pompeo said, "If you're looking for imminence, you need to look no further than the days that led up to the strike that was taken against Soleimani." But, Pompeo is a fucking retard. After several Republicans were briefed on the intelligence, Mike Lee said, "It was probably the worst briefing I have ever seen, at least on a military situation, in the 9 years I've served in the United States Senate." Rand Paul said, "None of it was overwhelming that X was going to happen." CNN reported congressional Democrats were highly critical with Representative Gary Connolly of Virginia calling the briefing sophomoric. Democratic presidential candidate Senator Elizabeth Warren said she wasn't convinced Soleimani presented an imminent threat the administration claimed to justify his killing, while Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois, the second-ranking Senate Democrat, disputed Esper's description of intelligence on Soleimani as exquisite. So, if the real reason behind the assassination was not that Soleimani posed an imminent threat, why else assassinate him? One of the articles I linked claimed that killing off Soleimani had been a long-term goal of Mike Pompeo's and that he was the main person who encouraged the strike. Based on a web browser search for Mike Pompeo Israel, it's pretty clear the guy is very connected to Israel. Apparently, he took a large part in Trump's administration's assassination. Apparently, he took a large part in Trump administration's ass-kissing of Israel. He said in an interview, quote, "Israel is not an occupying nation. As an evangelical Christian, I am convinced by my reading of the Bible that 3,000 years on now, in spite of the denial of so many, this land is the rightful homeland of the Jewish people. In other words, Pompeo is very, very stupid. How much of a link did Pompeo have with Israel? Was he just motivated by his Christian bullshit or something else? What role did Jared Kushner play? I don't have the means to prove anything like corruption or bribery via a direct quid pro quo case and cause and effect link. Even Congress finds that difficult. Part of what I'm doing is showing that Trump's and Netanyahu's actions were traitors or betraying based on the results and lack of rationality or reasoning for their decisions, and by eliminating or showing the improbability of other possible reasons. I'll tell you the perspective I'm coming from. Sometime during the school year prior to my 2012 video, I was in a class simulation of countries after 2008 negotiating to solve the global economic crisis. My overall solution, which I did a whole presentation and debated on, was to create more economic unions wherein government taxing, spending, and regulations are normalized across all countries as much as possible. Then and now, the obvious cause of economic disparity, ever-growing personal and government debts, environmental damage, and loose financial policies that cause sectors to be at risk of unstable fluctuations and manipulation, has been the fact that businesses and corrupting entities are able to play states off against each other. That has to stop. In Biden's first State of the Union, I heard him mention creating more such economically normalized unions, and Obama spoke about it in a recent speech to his foundation. Obama called the situation we are now in a race to the bottom. The first time I heard that term was in 2020. I was working at a high-end sporting goods store where a bunch of celebrities shopped. Most of the socks they sold were minimum priced $14 per pair and sold individually. The creator and former owner of one of the sock brands was there during the weekend of a nearby running convention. I asked him why they didn't sell their socks in bulk, and he said because that's a race to the bottom. At that moment, I understood that corporations had already learned to reduce how much they compete with each other. It probably wasn't even a coordinated thing. These companies know that if they kept lowering their prices against each other, they would all make less money, so they don't. Resisting the races to the bottom is obviously what countries have to do to stabilize prosperity, but we don't because there is too much manipulation, corruption, and plain stupid bullshit that detracts from the international negotiations and coordination towards this goal. This is one of the reasons why I tried to get you to resolve Ukraine quickly. If you publicly offered trading Donetsk, Luhansk independence for Taiwan independence, that and this Israel-Palestine situation and forming economic plans would have been much easier. I don't have access to your intel, and I don't know what is being said behind closed doors, but I think most likely you guys have screwed up a lot. Do you, or did you really think pressuring Russia with Ukraine's military and sanctions was going to work? What do you think is going to or even can happen now? I realized a few weeks after sending you my recommendations on Ukraine-Russia in March 2022 that their plan was to wait and hope for Trump to be re-elected so that he can recognize Russia's aggregated territory as theirs and allow China to take Taiwan. Recent polls show Trump beating Biden. Do you think you can handle these situations before the possibility you lose the next year? I tried getting you to resolve it quickly because they were counting on the attrition game. Yes, Trump would find a way to allow China to take Taiwan. Most likely, he will use something like the argument I gave in my first message. He will refer to us spending billions to assist Ukraine in military maintaining their territory, so it would be hypocritical of us if we didn't allow China to do the same. He will say something to make it look like he got a good deal, or talk tough on China to mask the extent he gets them what they really want. Vivek Ramaswamy has already been floating the idea of letting China take Taiwan. Think about the examples I gave of Trump's tariffs being damaging to U.S. interests and helpful to China's, plus how Trump recognized Hong Kong as China. Think about how assassinating Soleimani increased support for the Iranian regime. They are examples of pretending to punish while actually rewarding. They were deceptions played on Americans. Again, I wasn't paying attention to politics for most of the last decade. There are probably more examples of Trump and Netanyahu acting contrary to their stated intent. The Abraham Accords. If Netanyahu had tried annexing some of the West Bank, Israel would have been bombarded with international and legal pressure, more trouble than annexation would have been worth. Giving up the annexation for a deal with UAE was giving up nothing. Getting people to believe they have received something when they have received nothing is the bread and butter of a con artist. So that when I read that was reportedly the basis for the Abraham Accords, that Bahrain and the UAE said that what they got out of recognizing Israel was that a trade that they wouldn't annex part of the West Bank. Israel didn't really have the standing to annex the West Bank. He had Trump in the White House, who probably would have supported him, but the rest of the international community, the UN, and probably most of Europe would not have looked at that kindly. It wasn't like they had annexed the West Bank. They probably would not have actually been able to pull off without receiving a lot of punishment and retribution for it. So the idea that they were giving something up, or that the UAE and Bahrain were gaining something for when when Israel said, okay, we're not going to do what we can't do, or we're not already supposed to do, it's a joke, which probably means that the UAE and Bahrain got something else out of this. And particularly what they got out of it probably was legitimization, basically the props, or the looking like they were doing a peaceful, positive, complementary thing. When the UAE, and I know the UAE is a few different kingdoms combined into one group, one sort of country. And Bahrain, I don't remember exactly how Bahrain's run, but they were obviously gaining something for this, and were giving up nothing or getting nothing. They weren't gaining the Palestinians anything when this happened, because that wasn't supposed to happen already. Turning to the annexation of the West Bank, which could go through if Trump gets elected. They could feel gutsy enough to actually pull it off now, but back then, no. Back then, there would have been a lot. And obviously, they would, even if Trump does accept it, I don't know if they would be able to do it, because most of the rest of the world would still push back on them, unless they get support by Russia, unless the whole Russia and China's plan goes through. I don't know. There's a lot of options, but that all include like the U.S. looking like fools, pretty much. So I just read Israel assassinated another IRGC member, said Sayed Razi Mousavi in Israel. Why? You have to find out why they deemed it necessary to do that. Mousavi is the name of the main leader of the 2009 Green Movement, under house arrest since 2011. Sayed was close with Qasem Soleimani. A killing like that is going to get a lot of attention, and Iran will likely jumpstart support for the regime again. You may be wondering why. Why would Netanyahu and Trump be doing favors for China and Iran? What the fuck is going on? Israel, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other theocratic regimes have been effectively allies since the Arab Spring, because the number one threat to their religious regimes is their overthrow by their own populations. If Iran's Green Movement had worked and the Islamic Republic had been dismantled, Saudi Arabia and Netanyahu's conservative right-wing version of Israel would have been next. They share common threats like secularism, anti-religion, and anti-corruption more broadly. The more conservative versions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are generally united against the common threat of secularism, but they are not the same religion, so they are still going to conflict with each other. If there weren't secular pressures, they would still be fighting much more often. You would think that by now, after 1,000+ years, they would have been able to figure out which one of them was clearly correct, so that everyone had no qualms about converting and their squabbles could end, but of course their religions don't exist because any of them are correct. Ultimately, the function of theology is not to promote truth or knowledge or wisdom or moral standards or the good or righteous or stable societies. Its function is to monopolize the justification wars, or as Minister Bezalel Smotrich put it, the game of delegitimization and legitimization. Overall, theology's purpose is to accumulate as much fake legitimacy or freedom for others' claimed legitimacy as people can get away with. We know this because whenever we actually get down to the reasoning, evidence, and arguments for any of the religious belief systems that care to put them forth, especially the monotheistic ones, they're all very easy to disprove. Once you have the experience identifying leaps in logic, assumptions, circular reasoning, contradictions with edge of evidence, and contradictions within the beliefs themselves is child's play. When you understand that their apologists are persistent despite being disproved, you understand they espouse their beliefs just because they want to, and they want to because it either provides their superiority complex, control, and or relief from others' pressure and expectations. Liberals and leftists in the past few hundred years have mostly taken one of two positions. Either they're atheistic and anti-religious, or they just try to keep hardline religious beliefs out of government and social decisions as much as possible. I'm mostly in the anti-religious camp, and it's mostly because the other has issues. The first is that many religious people are very attached to their superiority complexes. The high they get from thinking they have the truth and righteousness on their side is often incomplete if they're told it's not significant enough to have actual impacts on anything in society. Therefore, these people will push for having their view be respected more than it should be, specifically embedded into real government systems with impact on other people's lives. Being able to manipulate people with religion usually confers material benefits and power or control. In general, being able to accurately describe and work with reality leads to realistic success. If someone is able to achieve these successes, others will naturally gravitate towards them and reward them. Being able to fake this success by shaming people into believing bullshit claims, or telling them they can do it too, is an easy workaround to gain respect without actually having to do anything for it. Religion is a very powerful tool for holding other people back. If you can run your mouth saying a bunch of garbage gibberish, but there is enough insistence, other people behind it, and a myth that the gibberish can't be discounted, you can very easily cause your target to pause, second-guess themselves, hold themselves back. If others hold themselves back, it opens more opportunities for you and reduces threats against you. The liberal view that merely tries to keep religion out of public policy has bad consequences, like causing people to be bad at assessing reality and decision-making while simultaneously having the power to drastically affect other people's lives in a democratic society. The liberal norm of not being critical of beliefs causes people to be less accurate and, effectively, be very stupid when others are depending on them not being stupid. Racism is not the only kind of delusional superiority complex, people thinking they have a superior ideology, knowledge, wisdom, culture, or morality are others. Many liberals are scared to push back against delusional mentalities too much, not just because Democrats are afraid of losing votes, but because they can have their own bullshit, and not just religious beliefs. A lot of it is because they don't like hurting other people's feelings or being offensive. Much of their fear is of the potential for real conflict caused by telling people their beliefs are garbage. I've tried a lot for almost 2 decades now to tell or show people their beliefs are wrong or perspective is lacking, but if it's not backed up by pressure, they can just choose to believe or not believe whatever makes them feel or look better. I'm extremely good at deconstructing bullshit by now, but it's a lot of wasted effort when nothing comes out of it or puts me in a position where I have to hurt people badly if they don't accept the better conclusion, especially if their mentality is harming me or an overall situation. I don't personally have a problem with hurting people at a certain point. The liberal idea that different opinions and perspectives have equal value or weight are sacred and therefore can't be punished is extremely bad for resolving issues. Liberalism allows bad situations to get worse over time. Our stance on Ukraine and Israel are very pertinent examples. I heard Biden be described as naive recently. Naivety is a fine start to describing the problem. You overestimate liberal democracy's ability to handle religiously conservative or right-wing people. They do not agree with or like the idea that different perspectives have equal weight. Any chance they get, they will try to suppress others. They will use religious institutions to implement or remove policies for a discriminatory result favorable to them. But when it's time for their wants and interests to be checked, they will whine for freedom and freedom of speech and fabricate baseless accusations like cheating on elections. Conservatives and right-wingers' goal is to monopolize control of society as much as possible. To that end, they attempt to monopolize the justification wars or morality by insisting on as many fake principles as they can scare people into or get away with. All real morality boils down to calibrations of greed. For example, if a person wants to say lying should be allowed, anyone can lie at any time, and it's up to others to make their own decisions and determine what is true or not. They are being extremely greedy with other people's time, attention, energy, and resources to have to sift through everything themselves. It defeats one of the main purposes of verbal communication as a method to share information and understanding more easily. If any two or more people are talking to each other and trying to calibrate what is moral or immoral, justified or greedy, the only things a person can 100% say are immoral are hypocrisy and double standards, because the offender is contradicting themselves. Israel has been accused of having double standards many times since the current Gaza-Hamas war began. Even the Pope seemed to suggest Israel was also a terrorist state. Conservative right-wingers reject more advanced approaches to problems, like morality based on greed, because they don't like having to give anything up. Second guess. All right, I'll start this over. Conservative right-wingers... my voice is going. Conservative right-wingers reject more advanced approaches to problems, like morality based on greed, because they don't like having to give anything up, second-guess, or disadvantage themselves. They feed off trying to identify overarching morals and wisdom that justify their own lives and claim their wisdom is the top pillars of truth. Whenever they are shown to be full of shit, they find another approach to work around, confuse, or frighten skepticism. It's like playing whack-a-mole. You pick apart one idea, and a few days, months, or years later, they'll get amnesia and come up with a fresh new shine on the same bullshit to waste your time with. They are not entirely stupid or immovable to amending their position, but you have to pressure them. They don't respond to anything but force, as in showing them they are wrong or beating them and not just shaming them into thinking they're bad. When you beat them again, harder. Opinions don't matter to these people. Democratic elections are not enough. They don't respond to anything but force of will. If you avoid a debate or fight because you're afraid of giving them a platform or of not being able to sift through their jungle of bullshit, it can look no different from you being unable to contend with them. If one of theirs avoids a debate, like Trump has been, they get excused as being above petty squabbles. You have to be able to hound them, hunt these people down, and finish their ability to recover. Not forcing them to accept they are full of shit allows them to fall back on delusional mentalities like cultural or racial fascism, persecution, or martyrdom. You have to be as definitive as you can be with them so they have no room to wiggle out of reality. More. The first time I wrote to you, the White House, I tried giving you an example of how to come to an effective and conclusive resolution quickly while getting as few people killed as possible. I'm going to get back on that point and try to do it again. The contemporary governments of Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel have a lot of very bad, problematic people. They rely on delusional bullshit to aggregate as much undue power, influence, and material wealth relative to their fellow citizens as they can, or relative to Palestinians in the case of Israel. States, countries, and nations are not monolithic entities. They do compete with other countries as entities to some extent, but nowadays, especially because of globalization, states are not as significant actors as the people and businesses within them. The Saudi and Iranian regimes have taken control of much of their country's businesses, wealth, and economy at the expense of their fellow citizens, and they use their religious bullshit to justify their control. Israel and Israelis have shown us what they are really like. As far as I've heard, they've killed more than 30,000 Gazans since October 7th, the vast majority, up to 90%, civilians. Judaism is an extremely racist religion with a big superiority complex. It is one of the few remaining religions that has a major explicitly racist component to their theology. The only religion I know of that is... The only other religion I know of that is explicitly racist is Mormonism, but they repudiated those parts a few decades ago. Christianity and Islam have often been effectively racist, but as far as I know, not explicitly within their actual doctrines. Gideon Levy, an Israeli, made a really good speech at an Israel lobby convention, not the actual Israeli lobbies. He explained that for there to be a change in Israel-Palestine, there is no way it will come from within Israel. Change has to be forced onto them by an international intervention, primarily from the US and EU. He explains that Israelis have lost connection with reality. He lists three ideas that are the rationality for allowing the Israelis to be so delusional and unrealistic. 1. Most Israelis, if not all, deeply believe we are the chosen... I'm quoting him now, Gideon Levy. Quote, most Israelis, if not all, deeply believe we are the chosen people, and if we are the chosen people, we have the right to do whatever we want. 2. There were more brutal occupations in history, but there was never in history a case where the occupier presented themselves as the victim, and not only the victim, but the only victim around. 3. The systematic dehumanization of the Palestinians enables us to do anything because if they are not humans like us, then there really is no question of human rights. There was a blip in the news when Netanyahu mentioned Amalek from the Bible when referring to Hamas. Quote, "You must remember what Amalek has done to you," says our Holy Bible. In 1 Samuel 15, God commanded the Israelites to kill all the Amalekites, men, women, children, and livestock. Supposedly, it was revenge for when the Amalekites attacked them as they left Egypt. Some people had issue with Netanyahu, as it sounded like he was suggesting the correct response was to kill all Gazans in the same way. There were other people God commanded the Israelites to annihilate besides the Amalekites. Deuteronomy 20, quote, "When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept and open their gates, all the people in it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. If they refuse to make peace and they engage you in battle, lay siege to that city. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put to the sword all the men in it. As for the women, children, and the livestock and everything else in the city, you may take these as plunder for yourselves, and you may use the plunder the Lord your God gives you from your enemies. This is how you are to treat all the cities that are a distance from you and do not belong to the nations nearby. However, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivitites, the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Otherwise, they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. When you lay siege to a city for a long time, fighting against it to capture it, do not destroy its trees by putting an axe to them, because you can eat their fruit. Do not cut them down. Are the trees people that you should besiege them? However, you may cut down trees that you know are not fruit trees and use them to build siege works until the city you are at war with falls. Deuteronomy 20 refers to how the Israelites acquired their entire land of Israel in the first place. Yes, Jews have lived there for 3,000 years, okay, which I have to say now is not actually true. I wasn't aware back when I wrote this, but there is actually no evidence for things like the Exodus. The Jews, as we know them now, as followers of the Torah, did not exist until a few centuries before BC. That when Netanyahu says that Moses 3,500 years ago did whatever supposedly he did, Moses didn't even exist, and it wasn't for sure wasn't 3,500 years ago that Judaism and the Jewish religion and the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, none of that existed until like 300 BC, less than 300 years BC. So this part is not even true. The Jews have not even, or at least obviously their descendants lived there, but they weren't like technically Jews. They were Yahwists. They worship a god Yahweh or Yahu, but he wasn't a monotheistic god. It wasn't the main god. It was Yahweh or Yahu was just the main. He was like Zeus. There are a bunch of Zeus allegories. When they actually find coins of him, he looks like Zeus. He has an eagle and stuff. So we know that it's not even true that really what happened was that it was created and began to come into play during the Maccabee dynasty, or it wasn't the Maccabee dynasty, I forgot the dynasty name, but the Maccabees. I forgot the name of the dynasty. Maccabee dynasty. Seleucid Hasmonean dynasty, which was only a few hundred years. So what really happened was that was when Judaism came into practice. Like it was actually practiced. That's when the archaeologists actually start finding history of Jewish actual religion being followed. That before there was a bunch of they ate shellfish before, they ate pigs. They have records of them buying and selling other like Hebrew people who spoke Hebrew. I'm not sure what their term was. They weren't called Jews because Jews were this were basically the sons of Judah, which was one of the Maccabees who overthrew the Seleucid dynasty, as far as I know. I think that's correct. Maybe not, but I'm pretty sure Jews is based on Judah, who was him, that one man's name. And that's when we have the creation of Jews and Judaism. And maybe some of their texts existed before a bit, but that's really when it came into play. And so this whole thing about 3,000 years, no, it was only around a few hundred years before BC, before even Christianity started to become a thing. So, all right, so I'll continue. Yes, Jews have lived there for a while. No, they didn't. Oh, yeah, the point is they only had control of it for 100 years. Jews had only had control of any part of it, and it wasn't even all of Israel. It was like a small, fairly small part. So it's this is how big they think it is, which is not, I can't exactly see where Israel is. Oh, Gaza's down here. Yeah, it's most of Israel, and plus some more. So that was when Judaism became a thing, under the Hasmonean dynasty. Very, very recently compared to what's claimed. And it didn't even last for 100 years. So what happened was they couldn't agree on what it was they believed. So they had a civil war, and then Rome stepped in. And then after the civil war, Rome basically didn't completely take control over, but it became a client state of Rome. So the Jews as we think of them now, really only had control of the region for about 100 years, and then never again after that. And that's it. There is this whole claim about it's the historic homeland is not even true. Like, obviously their ethnic descendants or their genetics, some of it possibly was from there. I don't know how much genetic testing, but the idea that it's of the religion Jews, and probably the problem is that there's a bunch of overlap between the ethnicity Judaism and the religion Judaism, and that's bullshit. That's a trick. But you can't conflate. Like, I was raised Catholic, but I'm not ethnically Catholic. This conflation of ethnicity with religion is a very bad idea. So this whole idea that Judaism, that it's the Jews' home, it's not even true. It's at all true. And some people I was listening to a lot was like Myth Vision and Gnostic Informant. If you really want to learn a lot more, those are some YouTubers, but it's not just YouTubers. Gad Barnea, they interview a bunch of professionals and experts and actual archaeologists and linguists. And we know now that that Judaism was invented 200 to 300 years, or 1 to 300 years BC. Anyways, or 1.5 to 300 years BC. So they killed most of them just because they wanted the land. Did you notice the part where God told the Israelites to treat trees nicer than people? He said, when you lay to siege the city, fight against them, because you can, but do not destroy the trees by putting an axe to them, because you can eat their fruit. Do not cut them down. Are the trees people that you should besiege them? So it's like, why would you kill the trees? They're not people. So, okay, anyways, going on. That's a whole more topic that can obviously be expanded on. So I was reminded of this classic gem of a short video recently. It inspired me to read the whole book of Ezekiel. I don't know if this was the first time I read the whole book in the Bible. Might have been. I'm pretty sure I read the whole book, a whole book at some point. Not the entire Bible. But this, Cooking with Yahweh Non-Stamp Collector. This is a freaking classic. I'm not going to play it, but I just want you to see it. Go watch it. It's friggin' hilarious. Anyways, all right, yeah, that's it. I want you to read the entire book of Ezekiel. Read it keeping in mind that it's not actually the inspired word of God, rather just some stupid Jew trying to retroactively make past events fit into their delusional belief system. Apparently, after the Jews had lived in Israel for some period of time, God started to get mad at them because he's a stupid little bitch and his mentality can't handle some idolatry. God sounds like an insane psychopathic retard in this book, super repetitive. So God threatens to punish God decides to threaten punishing the Jews by causing other peoples to conquer and fuck them over. He has Ezekiel pretend like he's besieging the city of Jerusalem as a sign to the Jews they will be attacked unless they change their ways. God says he will make them a ruin, a reproach, a warning, and an object of horror to all the nations around them as he inflicts his wrath upon them, and will bring the sword upon them and make their land a desert, and apparently parents and children will eat each other, among other things. At some point, God commands a few of them to go through Jerusalem and kill all their own people who are not sad enough about how idolatrous Jews have become. There is a few passage about punishing prostitution. Then the king of Jerusalem will be abducted to Babylon and forced to sign a treaty. This prophecy shit goes on for a while. Eventually, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon comes and beats their asses. It was worded as prophecy, but it was obviously written after the fact. Ezekiel 25 gets devious. God's prophecies turn from how fucked Israel gets by Babylon to how God is going to enslave and slaughter other nations and cities because supposedly they rejoiced in Israel's punishment. He starts with Ammon, Moab, Edom, and Philistia. He says the Israelites specifically will kill all men and beasts in vengeance for that time when Edom took vengeance on Judah. He prophesies vengeance on more peoples because they also apparently rejoiced in Israel's misfortune. Tyre, Sidon, Egypt, Cush, Libya, Arabia, Lydia, Kub. Eventually, after punishing everyone who laughed at Israel because Nebuchadnezzar conquered them, because God made him do it as his instrument for Israel's punishment, God becomes satisfied, then all the special Jewish holy places in Jerusalem are restored. The idea that other nearby nations have to pay for Israel's misfortune, even though they had nothing to do with causing it, has long been a Jewish mentality. It's what Gideon Levy was referring to when he said, quote, "There were more brutal occupations in history, but there was never in history a case where the occupier presented themselves as the victim, and not only the victim, but the only victim around." When Israelis initially took the land from the people living in what they called Israel after fleeing slavery in Egypt, at least according to their story that they themselves wrote, when they took out their frustration against neighbors after being conquered by Babylon in the last century when they took land in Israel from Palestinians living there at the time, have all been caused by this same delusionally indignant, greedy ideology. The book of Ezekiel reveals a resistance by Israelis to accept their beliefs are flawed, instead of their own inadequacies and ideological racism being the cause of Jerusalem's downfall. Framing it as God's punishment for idolatry made it sound like their conquering was because they weren't true to their beliefs enough. Gideon Levy again highlighted this as the Israelis thinking they are the chosen people and perpetual victims who are justified in doing whatever they want as long as they remain Jews. Zelensky and Ukraine's response to Russia's incursion is the same type of mentality. In the letter I sent to the White House in March 2022, I explained how Russia had some very legitimate reasons for taking over land in Ukraine that Putin himself explained very clearly. Ukraine disenfranchised about half of its voters by ousting Viktor Yanukovych because of his deal with Russia, cut off water to Crimea after Crimeans overwhelmingly voted to join Russia, ignored the Minsk agreement they were party to in 2014, and allowed a mini-civil war within their own country between Ukrainians and Russian Ukrainians that killed several thousands of people. I'm not aware of Zelensky ever acknowledging possible Ukraine mistakes. He keeps demanding Russia must completely pull out of the country or no negotiations can happen. How would Russia think that's a good idea outside of force, or why would Russia? I told you Ukraine probably would not be able to force out Russia because Russia's ambition was not actually very big. Media articles at the time and still now continue to suggest Russia wants to take over Ukraine. Russia does not want to take over Ukraine. They are not that stupid. You guys decided to help Ukraine gamble on the fight, and even though I told you pretty much exactly what Russia and China were planning, you couldn't stop it. The only thing you have been able to do is pretend like you're preventing their mischaracterized goals. Some people call that strawmanning. You have been able to draw out the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and it may be the case that Russia and China's capabilities are starting to strain, but now they've found a way to double the pressure on us by highlighting another one of our obvious double standards in supporting Israel's heinous shit. If at any point you guys ever suggested a deal for Taiwan's independence like I suggested, my guess is it was in the fall of 2022. Apparently, there was a point when Lloyd Austin's counterpart in China cut communications with us, and around that time was when we started authorizing sending tanks and other heavy weapons to Ukraine. That took you way too long. We had already run our mouths and buried our stance for half a year. I'm guessing what Austin said came off as very stupid or pathetic, or maybe they feigned being offended because he accurately called out their intent. I knew it would be very difficult to convince you guys that offering that deal was the way to go. Biden himself is very stubborn. But the thing is, Russia and China knew Biden is stubborn. They knew all of you Democrats would find it very difficult to give into anything that may acknowledge Putin or Xi are in the right. They played you. And now we are being played again. Your stubbornness is again burying you in an indefensible position, which more and more people will call you out on over time. As we see with the polls, it doesn't require persuading very many people to get you out. Why you? Are they specifically targeting you? Do they have an axe to grind against you? Yes. Your liberal bullshit is a threat to them. Even if you think you are just being tolerant, they either know better not to be tolerant or are trying to retain their justifications for being corrupt, greedy pieces of shit. Whether they are just corrupt, greedy bastards and or theocratic dictators and or anti-manipulative, double-standard justification warriors, they will oppose you. You have to accept that they have the upper hand. They have the momentum. They have the leverage. Time is on their side. You can't keep thinking shaming them is going to work. You can't think taking them head on is going to work. So what do? Think of it like judo or something. They have the initiative. They have the momentum. They have the pressure. You have to sidestep, grab them, force them more in the direction they are already going, overwhelming their corrective breaks, cut them off from retreat, unbalance them, and throw or sweep them. This was the general idea when I proposed trading what Russia wanted for Taiwan independence. It would have been a fair deal, and it would have stopped Russia, China, and shitheads like Trump and Ramaswamy from gaining the moral or public opinion upper hand, plus it would have been the right thing to do. Speaking of the right thing to do, when I wrote that previous letter, I wasn't completely familiar with the history between China and Taiwan. I looked at some historic claims recently, and if they're true, it's pretty obvious China has way more of a claim to Taiwan than Ukraine has to Donetsk, Luhansk. Chiang Kai-shek killed some thousands or millions of communists, then took tons of the country's gold and currency reserves, plus most of the navy to the tiny island of Taiwan, where he installed a brutal regime for a few decades until they decided to become more capitalistic and democratic because they had a ton of money and needed our support. Even if China were to accept Taiwan independence, they would probably demand reimbursement of some kind. Now we are faced with the possibility of losing on multiple fronts. If the pressure for a two-state solution of Israel and Palestine continues to mount, and it actually happens, then the shitheads win, and goals of reducing corruption and theocratic... I have to start this over. If the pressure for a two-state solution of Israel and Palestine continues to mount, and it actually happens, then the shitheads win, and the goal of reducing corruption and theocratic totalitarianism and creating more global economic cooperation pacts are not going to happen. Look, I know you guys have been saying that a two-state solution needs to happen, but it's not a good idea. If it does, it will legitimize religious regimes, especially Iran and Saudi Arabia, and by extension, the potentially corrupt aspects in other countries like Russia and China. Any chance for change of Iran and Saudi Arabia's governments will be gone. It will reinforce dividing people along racial, religious lines and allow the corrupt and totalitarian control of regimes in any country to persist, and the division will make it easier for international organizations to play countries off against each other. There is no guarantee fighting between Jews and Muslims will stop. But, of course, allowing the way Israel conducts itself is not acceptable either. Israelis have proven themselves to be extremely hypocritical, terrorist, racist, manipulative group of people who cannot be trusted with running an egalitarian country, let alone having the destructive force of nuclear weapons. The absolute best solution to this problem is to unrecognize Israel. That land can no longer be called Israel. It has to be replaced with an internationally multilaterally protected neutral zone, just like what should have happened with eastern Ukraine. Of course, the Israelis are not going to immediately accept it. We have to do it unilaterally. Do not wait or depend on them to make the right decisions. Do not count on them removing Netanyahu or his net job allies after the Gaza siege is done. They won't. Maybe I wasn't clear when suggesting the deal for Taiwan. For it to work, the offer would have to been made publicly. It would have to It would have put credibility on your side by adhering to its single standard, pressured them into it, and showed you are serious by committing yourself to a conclusion. You can't be a bitch with this. The deal I proposed would have left no room for criticism of your position. If you want your goal to succeed against how critical people are nowadays, it has to be unchallengeable. I watched Lex Friedman's interview with Netanyahu. While talking about a deal with Saudi Arabia, at 52 minutes, Netanyahu said, after World War I, President Woodrow Wilson said, quote, I believe in open covenants openly arrived at, end quote. Netanyahu continued to say, I have my own correction. I believe in open covenants secretly arrived at, end quote. This is a stupid bitch's strategy, worse than a stupid bitch's. It allows too much room for corruption in terms of the deals hidden from people they affect. It hides the reasoning and background information behind the deals. When Friedman later asked him about Ukraine, Netanyahu couldn't resist bringing up Iran and nuclear weapons again. Then he said he knows both Zelensky and Putin, but doesn't think they're ready for talks to enter a room together. What a useless piece of shit. Right now, I'd say, what a useless fucking bitch. Fucking shitbag. Not bitch, shitbag. What a useless fucking shitbag. You would think he is the one person in the best position to mediate between them. But he can't, because if he were to take either side, it would look hypocritical of him in one way or another. Netanyahu has been allied with Putin, but he can't openly support Putin because that would look like supporting an aggressive military action like Muslims against Israel, and it would condone attacking a country led by a fellow Jew. But he can't support Zelensky because Putin's want of more territory and defending of ethnic Russians is more like his goal for Israel. Netanyahu's neutrality on Ukraine-Russia shows he's an opportunistic little bitch without any real standards besides his theocratic, racist, nationalistic expansion of Israel. He is unable to be consistent because of his bullshit goals and beliefs. Consistency is one reason why we must unrecognize Israel. If we allow theocratic and racist regimes to persist just because they are nominally democratic and support some of our interests, it will be impossible to deconstruct Muslim fundamentalist regimes and other authoritarian regimes. And it will be impossible to have the clout to push for international economic and environmental goals among whatever other international goals you think are important. Think about Abraham Lincoln debating Stephen Douglas. Here's a good point. Abraham Lincoln debating Stephen Douglas before the Civil War. In the first debate, Lincoln said, quote, I hate indifference to slavery because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions with plausibility to taunt us as hypocrites, causes the real friends of freedom to doubt our sincerity, and especially because it forces so many really good men amongst ourselves into an open war with the very fundamental principles of civil liberty, criticizing the Declaration of Independence and insisting that there is no right principle of action but self-interest. I don't think I need to add anything to that. The support of Israel has the same effects. Think about how stupid Stephen Douglas's position was. Quote, I deny the right of Congress to force a slaveholding state upon an unwilling people. I deny their right to force a free state upon an unwilling people. I deny their right to force a good thing upon a people who are unwilling to receive it. The great principle is the right of every community to judge and decide for itself whether a thing is right or wrong, whether it would be good or evil for them to adopt it. And the right of free action, the right of free thought, the right of free judgment upon the question is dearer to every true American than any under a free government. End quote. Douglas anchored his argument on the idea of states' rights, but gave no reason why the line for those rights were at this state or community and not a type of person, racial community, or individual. He was resistant to the federal government setting the standards, even through Congress, just because. Because what? I don't know. Just because. No, obviously it was because he was cherry-picking the method of decision-making that would happen to favor the outcome that he wanted. Douglas avoided the question of whether or not slavery should be permitted entirely. China's non-interference policy is the same position Stephen Douglas took. There were no reasons the status of slavery should have been decided by the states and different from state to state. States' rights is a made-up principle. It is a kind of liberal idea that sounds good on paper, but effectively allows a lot of bad, problematic shit to continue. Even though China supports Russia, they have never actually condemned Ukraine. It's because the only argument in favor of Ukraine is one that prioritizes state sovereignty over the will and well-being of the people. I told you that when you support Ukraine, you are making China's argument for them. If someone favorable to China ever wins our presidency, they will use that justification, allowing China to take Taiwan. The problem you inevitably arrive at when decisions are rooted too much on supposed principles like sovereignty is that someone else can easily have or claim another principle entirely. Slavery in a free market is a contradiction because in a free market or capitalist system, people are due compensation for their work. I don't need to appeal to some supposed principle to show that slavery is a bad idea. Lincoln was essentially making the same argument when he said, quote, "That is the real issue. That is the issue that will continue in this country when these poor tongues of Judge Douglas and myself shall be silent. It is the eternal struggle between these two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. They are the two principles that have stood face to face from the beginning of time and will ever continue to struggle. The one is the common right of humanity, and the other is divine right of kings. It is the same principle on whatever shape it develops itself. It is the same spirit that says, you work and toil and earn bread, and I'll eat it, no matter in what shape it comes, whether from the mouth of a king who seeks to bestride the people of his own nation and live by the fruit of their labor, or from one race of men as an apology for enslaving another race. It is the same tyrannical principle." End quote. The principle of wrong is a contradiction. It's a long way of saying Douglas and himself are not actually talking about principles, but whether there should be commonly applied rights. Or a common applied rights, which basically means a common standard. Basically, the principle of right and wrong, he was basically saying that these are two principles, are just two ideologies, and you can just claim them even though they're in contradiction with each other. They're not actually based on any kind of reality, they're just ideas. So, arbitrarily picking the state or the community as the entity where rights reside is similar to supporting Ukraine's claim that their state sovereignty is where the rights reside instead of the will of the people living there. Israel is founded on their supposed divine right to exist. Lincoln opposed both of these ideas. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed to oppose divine slavery and create common standards across our country. I understand there's a lot to juggle here. There may be information and reasoning I am not privy to that would make unrecognizing Israel not the best decision, but I doubt it. At this point, any benefits of Israel existing are far outweighed by the negatives. The history of the United States has explicitly stood against the idea of divine right. Israel has been completely useless with solving Ukraine-Russia. Israel is no more a democracy than Iran is a democracy. Iran limits who can be voted for based on ideology. Israel limits who can be voted for via their racial and ideological right of return. Netanyahu has been extremely manipulative and in collusion with Islamic fundamentalist regimes to provide legitimacy for each other's fundamentalist governments and policies. It doesn't matter how much you pander to them. They will work to get Trump reelected, and Trump will work to get them whatever he can. Israel is with China, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others in attempting to buffer corrupt regimes against outside influence. The idea of state sovereignty that China often voices is the same principle Stephen Douglas argued for that would have allowed the continuation of slavery. Judaism is a racist religion. Even the anti-Zionist Orthodox Jews who oppose Zionism have their ideological superiority complex. Even though Judaism has been around longer than Christianity and Islam, the numbers have always been significantly fewer because they limit their membership, because they are explicitly racist, or say tribalistic maybe. And oh yeah, the main reason Israel's a problem is that it's based on bullshit. So is Christianity, so is Islam. Deriving states, systems, and laws based on bullshit will never be a long-term sustainable project because it's bullshit and too easily understood to be bullshit, especially nowadays. I'm well aware that unrecognizing Israel is obviously the best decision to make. From what I have seen in videos and articles on the internet, there are around 6 basic excuses people use to resist accepting this. 1. Delusional beliefs of Christians and Jews promote the existence of Israel. Two, there are a lot of power and economic interests that buy existence of Israel and buy many of our politicians. These interests largely overlap with number one. Number three, tolerance. Number four, Israel and the Jews are there and they are not going anywhere. Number five, yeah, the ethno-nationalist conservative Jews are bad, but the fundamentalist Muslims are significantly worse and have multiple officially Muslim countries. And six, Israel is aligned with our goals and national security interests. I'm really trying to wrap this up, but as long as I've gotten this far and this much is actually read, it would be a waste if I didn't start to smash the more prominent objections. I am reluctant to preempt objections because bullshit's nature is unending if definitive conclusions are not periodically reached. So number one, Judaism and Christianity are wrong. We know they are wrong. I was raised Catholic by Catholics in Catholic schools until college. Catholics have a long tradition of trying to come up with logical and rational arguments in their favor, especially when forced to justify their bullshit after the Protestant Reformation. Jews also like pretending they are logical or rational when conjuring modern interpretations of their outdated laws. I'm well aware of Catholic and Jewish arguments for their religions, and I am well aware they are all garbage. I can give a few examples of why they are wrong and how to actually think about reality. A. The uncaused caused claim is based on the observation of cause and effect. It posits that chains of cause and effect cannot go on infinitely, and so there must be a beginning, a thing that was infinite which started the chain and we are now observing. The problem is that cause and effect is an incomplete description of what we are seeing. We observe the first law of thermodynamics, where it appears that matter cannot be created or destroyed. Every time we observe, quote, cause and effect, there is a morphing of energy and matter to the point where the cause no longer exists in its previous state. When an apple grows into a tree, the apple is no longer there. When an animal is eaten to sustain and grow another organism, the animal is no longer there. The supposed strength of the uncaused cause claim is that it is based on empirical observation, but throws out what we observe, that causes lose energy and or mass halfway through the argument. Even if there was an uncaused cause, according to the first law of thermodynamics, there is no reason to believe it is still around. It would have lost something to become the universe, contradicting the idea that God is infinite. B. When intelligent design was a common attempt to work around creationism's ban in schools, the blind watchmaker analogy was part of the intelligent design reasoning. It posited that if a person found a watch on an island with no other sign of intelligence, the finder could conclude that something with intelligence designed and made the watch because it could be observed to have a purpose and was irreducibly complex. The first problem with the analogy is that life is not irreducibly complex. Evolution is more than sufficient explanation for the development of biological complexity over long periods of time. Even if evolution wasn't good enough theory, what was the purpose of the universe? The analogy depends on the discoverer of the watch being able to identify a purpose or reason for an intelligence would have for it. Watches track time and look nifty. What purpose does a universe have to an outside creator? We could say the universe serves us a purpose, but we already believe we exist. The only way for us to know the purpose of a universe is to the creator, is if that creator tells us. But the existence of the creator is what the argument is trying to prove in the first place. It's circular. All arguments for monotheistic God are self-contradicting, circular, and/or assumptions. Some people have the decency to understand there isn't enough justification to realize the consequences of their religion on the world, but you can't expect them to maintain that decency when they gain a position with that potential power. So, second point. I've heard that pro-Israeli lobbies have an oversized influence on our elections, but I don't think antagonizing them would make re-election insurmountable. Now, when I said this, I don't know, it's hard to say if that was true. Nowadays, because of how close the election is, that's definitely being a factor. And of course, I'm not the expert on this, but from what I've heard, that this may not be true. It could be that, yeah, there's a lot of lobbies, and not just Israelis lobbies, but Christian lobbies and groups in the United States. I've given you evidence and argumentation that Israel is not just an inconvenience for us, but they have been actively working against us. Proposing unrecognizing Israel will cause a shitstorm. Many Christians and Jews would fling all their shit at you, us. But once you understand that the gravity of the situation, how traitorous Israel is to us, and how to thrash delusional bullshit, it's possible to bulldoze through their hail of garbage. I'm not going to lie. For people like you, it would be difficult. For someone like me, super easy. I can pinpoint the bullshit in what people say on a moment-to-moment basis, like the examples I gave in 1. If someone is trying to pass bullshit off as true, wise, or righteous, there is always at least one weak point that can be targeted to collapse their position, even when they vociferously feign moral outrage. The next key step is to force them to acknowledge they were full of shit before they can change the subject. If they resist, the third step is to clearly remind everyone involved what the basic claim of their bullshit is so they can't claim they forgot, even if they don't accept they were full of shit. Rinse and repeat. If this happens several times, you can identify patterns that reveal ulterior motives to their conclusions besides them actually being reasonable. Then write them off as not being willing to adhere to common standards and wanting special treatment. In other words, they're fascist, racist, delusional, manipulative liars, or some other pejorative based on the bullshit they're pushing for. Ultimately, you can smoothen out relations by acknowledging that people fighting for themselves is not inherently bad, but bullshitting in the process is bad. Now, Harris has taken, obviously, a more amicable approach, saying things like, we're all in this together. That is another tact. That's not the tact that I specialize in. Whether that'll work, whether that's good enough, I don't know. It's hard to, I guess we'll see, but my impression is that it has a lot of weak points. I actually think you need both. Yes, you need, I like what some, a lot of times she's criticized for saying word salad stuff, and that's just a bunch of positivity. We're all in this together kind of stuff. But I think you actually have to take both angles, good cop, bad cop kind of thing. That, yes, the inclination is to be compassionate and kind and coordinatable, willing to work with others, collaborative, but you also have to have the arm that punishes people for being, manipulative, delusional, full of shit, trying to screw you over or, cause harm. You basically have to have both. So that gets to 3. Tolerance, yes and no. Mostly no. Tolerance to the point of experimentation, adventure, experience, fun, learning, challenge, excitement, wonder is great. But for when decisions or policies or perspectives are going to have substantial effects, not a really good idea. People who make life-changing propositions need to be held to significantly better standards. The House resolution saying anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism is pathetic. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. I think that includes other countries. Just because it was a resolution doesn't make them less retarded. The Jews don't need to go anywhere. The land just has to not be called Israel. It is important to the Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Unrecognizing Israel is not capitulation to extremists because the Zionists are extremists when they hoard it for themselves, killing, expelling others in the process with whatever excuses they can. The existence of fundamentalist Islamic countries is not an excuse. It is important to apply the same standards across all people, but there are also better standards than others, ones based on reality. Maybe you can argue that allowing people to take their delusions seriously to the point of nationalizing them has some sort of benefit, but the main purpose of these delusions is to fabricate reasons to apply double standards. Take religious tax exemption, for example. Scientific, commercial, and religious claims all apply to the same reality. They are not claims about different universes. So why does religious bullshit get special treatment? Because accruing special treatment while offering nothing is their purpose. When any of these claims infringe upon the other, they conflict because they are ultimately about accruing worldly benefits for specific people. You can't let one gain a special advantage. If you can't let some of them gain an advantage because they are inherently full of shit, you can't let any of them gain an advantage. 5. Yes, Islam has been more of a problem than Judaism, but only because Judaism is smaller, has a lot more limited scope of territory as its goal, and its racism prevents evangelization. They don't push their beliefs on others besides the idea that Jews should receive special treatment. The grossly disproportionate response of Israel on Gaza shows Israel's collective mentality is at least as bad as Muslims. Besides, if Judaism didn't exist, Islam wouldn't exist. Islam was created in response to the Catholic Church's attempt to monopolize moral justifications and center that control of Europe. There was no reason for the Arabs to accept Europe's monopoly, so they created their own monopoly in their own land with significantly more and concrete religious claims. When more than one group of people believe God chose them or their prophets as one chosen people or ideology, whenever they think their bullshit should have a real effect on the same part of the world, they are going to want to kill each other. An Israeli historian, Ilan Pappé, said in debate that, quote, "The Jews were treated in the Arab world much better than they were treated in the Christian world. All this fabric that was holding on for centuries was broken down first by the Zionist ideology that told Jews in the Arab world that they did not belong in the Arab world, and by reaction by fanatic Arab nationalism saying, okay, you have to decide whether you are Zionist or you are Jews. I don't know," end quote. I don't know the historical sources Pape refers to when making that claim, but I understand the want to fuck up people who think they should be deferred to based on unsubstantiated claims. Ultimately, Israel is a bulwark for Islamic fundamentalism, not against it. 6. Israel is not aligned with our interests. Take, for example, the recent split between Erdogan and Netanyahu. Erdogan, who's the president of Turkey, Erdogan implied Netanyahu is worse than Hitler. Then Netanyahu accused Erdogan of committing genocide against the Kurds. First, this is the first time an Israeli prime minister has likened Turkey's actions against the Kurds to genocide since 2019, maybe ever. I'm not completely aware, but I'm pretty sure at least 2019. I'm pretty sure he said nothing of it when Trump pulled out of Syria and allowed Turkey to attack the Kurds then. So Netanyahu thought Turkey was committing genocide all these last 4 years, but said nothing? Again, at best, Israel and Netanyahu are useless. Second, there's little difference between how Turkey treats the Kurds and Israel and the Palestinians. You would think Erdogan and Netanyahu would understand this and not point at each other, but they both did. Do you think Netanyahu will catch that irony and understand he is being genocidal too? Yes, he probably will. Is he going to stop? What? Third, the implication being no, he's not going to stop. He knows he's being genocidal. Like, the fact that both of these fucking retards both had orders to kill a bunch of an ethnic minority within their country's control, and they accused each other of being genocidal when they were doing the exact same thing at each other. Is it because they're stupid? I don't think so. I think it's that they're trying to normalize it. Yes. Third, they are normalizing genocide. When they talk like this and openly air their atrocities, the goal is to normalize their ethnic cleansing. Again, all these actors who are trying to monopolize the control of their territory they have power in are essentially allied with each other against liberal pressures. Fourth, the last problem I will mention is that both these situations implicate us, the United States. We enabled and are enabling both of these attacks to happen. I'm not certain what you guys thought about Trump abandoning the Kurds, but my guess is you didn't agree with it. From our perspective, there was zero benefit to it, and the headlines recently say Netanyahu thanked you, the Biden administration, for more weapon sales, fingering you as the enabler, just like Putin has done with Ukraine. I told you when the Ukraine-Russia conflict began that it was the start of a big push to take discourse power from the West. Netanyahu is helping them with that. It took me a few weeks to figure out how to say this. Tolerating delusions with intolerant superiority complex is a self-contradiction. On the extreme end, it results in situations like our Civil War, split between the North and the South. On the more moderate end, it results in bullshit accusations of illegal or improper or inappropriate behavior in order to tar the reputation of or justify attacking civil opponents. For example, the problem with January 6th was not that it was an insurrection. The problem is that it was based on bullshit. If there really was a secret deep state cabal that manipulated the mechanics of an election to steal a result, it would be a betrayal of the promise of democracy, and therefore, an insurrection against the people orchestrating the steal would be warranted. What else would you do? If it was true that this deep state was so prolific, appealing to the courts wouldn't necessarily work because they could be cheaters and thieves too. It would mean the system has drastic flaws, is based on lies, and the only option would be to infiltrate it, expose it, and possibly tear it down to start anew. Or, at minimum, it would mean there were a lot of Democrats who needed to be prosecuted and possibly executed for treason against the Constitution of the United States. Who else would be behind it? What Trump did was not just a threat to democracy, this was a threat to you, your lives, your goals, your ambitions, your priorities, and vision, and those of the people who voted for you. When he lies about you, trying to either prevent you from taking office or handicap your efforts while in office, he steals from the people who voted for you. None of Trump et al.'s claims of election fraud had any reasons to even suspect were true. There were not only zero concrete examples of instances of voter fraud or vote tampering given, there was no reason to even suspect Biden's win was even remotely unlikely. When Trump beat Hillary, he didn't even win the popular vote then. Even if Trump beat Biden with an electoral college margin, he would again have lost the popular vote. In order to make the claim the election was actually really stolen, you would have had to believe there was no chance Biden actually won legitimately. Even if Trump and or his supporters really believe the election was stolen, it doesn't matter, because ultimately, with no examples of election theft and the popular vote showing Trump's loss was well within the realm of possibility, the only, quote, evidence was just not wanting to believe Biden's win. The only perspective a want like that comes from is the want to believe in one's own inherent superiority or deservedness, or others' inferiority, undeservedness. Without any evidence or reasoning, there is no way to distinguish between a person actually believing something is true or just wanting to believe something is true, which pretty much makes them equal. That's really how we know that they didn't actually believe it's true, because they didn't have any reason to. They just preferred to. They just wanted to. Trump specifically just wanted to believe it was true. In the recent talk about the possible removal of Trump from ballots, I have frequently heard references made to how officials in the Confederacy were barred from holding public office after the war. However, our Civil War was not actually an insurrection. Lincoln set up Fort Sumter to make it look like an insurrection when the Confederacy attacked, but the cause was him choosing to not recognize or negotiate with the Confederacy and not withdrawing Union troops from forts in the South. The Confederacy was formed directly because of the abolitionist movement in the North, as several of the states explicitly explained when they seceded. Not recognizing the Confederacy was a hostile act, and keeping forts in its territory was a provocation and occupation. It opened the potential for offensive action and damaging policy decisions against the Confederacy. Before Jefferson Davis ordered Sumter attacked, Lincoln declared sending a ship supplying only food to the fort and not munitions, but the fort already had munitions and soldiers to use them. When Sumter was attacked, the war was sold as a defense of the Union, but the status of Union forts in the Confederacy could easily have been negotiated if Lincoln recognized the Confederacy. The Confederacy attacked the fort because they believed it was a threat, because it was a threat, because Lincoln was a threat to them. Remember how Lincoln said he hated slavery. Even though he tried being diplomatic, his personal goal was to force the slave states to relinquish their slavery, to definitively abolish it as a de facto contradiction to the founding identity of the United States. The North aggressively forced the South to end slavery, regardless of how the start of the conflict was framed. But the southern states had been part of the Union. Some of the founding that created and maintained the forts would have come from the South before secessions. The Union maintaining control over those forts was essentially theft and occupation, if you look at it in diplomatic and economic terms. After all, the Confederate States held delegations to secede from the Union. They all voted for it. It was democracy at work, right? What was the justification for the Union declining to recognize the Confederacy? There was no justification, really. They just decided to not tolerate their stupid bullshit. The Confederacy was full of shit, believing voting was enough to decide the fated association of everyone who lived in their states, while the majority of people could not vote, and a huge amount of certain type of people were not even recognized for their work or allowed to live on their own, lacked justification, just because the idea of divine right was applied to a larger race or group of people than a specific king family in a monarchy doesn't make it any more legitimate. The Union had to decide to attack them for it. The Union had to decide to attack them for it. The Union had to fuck up the Confederacy because of their bullshit. They were aggressive and offensive. They forced them to accept a more consistent, more universal standard. Neither democracy nor voting is an excuse for bullshit. Using offensive violence against actions and policies justified by delusions that have real negative effects on you, your people's, or your partner's lives is a very good idea. Since we live in an increasingly connected social world, our partners more and more include everyone. If you have goals or necessities that require more people to recognize they are partners, you have to understand, accept, and affirm that you are a threat to the people who create fake divisions and bullshit justifications. Even if people are not direct targets of bullshit, they can still be indirect targets. Even though people who voted for Biden are not Biden, he was elected to represent their wills and goals. Attacking Biden with bullshit attacks his voters with bullshit. Again, attacking Biden with bullshit attacks his voters with bullshit. It's the same with Trump. If you attack or restrain Trump, you are attacking or restraining his voters. You have to understand this is what you are doing and do it. When Israelis make a special claim on a special piece of land because of their special delusional bullshit that only applies to them at the automatic expense of others, you have to fuck them up for it. Does Israel have a right to exist? No, you fucking idiots. Just like the Confederacy didn't have the right to exist. Just because a country has voting in it doesn't justify its delusional premise for existing, particularly when that delusion has built-in discrimination. You have to stop permitting bullshit because of the idea of religious freedom. Several Confederate states claimed slavery was divinely ordained. They turned out to be wrong. Quote, divinely ordained. Actually said Texas and I forget the other one, but there's one more. I don't remember if it was Kentucky or Tennessee. I know Texas was one. How do you think China was able to mediate the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia? You guys had been harping on China for several years for imprisoning Muslim Uyghurs in forced work re-education camps. Doesn't China discriminate against Muslims? Aren't Saudi Arabia and Iran Islamic nations? How did China normalize relations with the Taliban? Because conservatives dislike liberalism more than they dislike other definitive claims. I read that you weren't surprised when Iran-Saudi deal happened. Bullshit. Maybe you weren't surprised because Saudis were telling you what was happening at all times, but I bet you didn't really know how or why it happened. I wasn't surprised because I already knew the Iranian and Saudi regimes were allies due to their shared threat of liberalism. If one fell, the other would fall. China's non-interference policy favors them, but part of the reason it happened was just to make you look bad. This was made more obvious when bin Salman no-showed Blinken during their scheduled meeting while Blinken was in Arabia recently. That was back then. It's not really surprising. We exposed bin Salman for his most likely ordering of Jamal Khashoggi's killing, so he decided to give China a nod towards their effort to change the world order. I saw in an interview with Norm Finkelstein recently where he was doubtful South Africa's International Criminal Court Justice case, ICJ, Court of Justice, International Criminal Court Justice case would succeed because Russia and China may be accusable of genocide with Ukraine and the Uyghurs. Finkelstein is an Israeli extremely hypocritical of their occupation of Palestine who has been making rounds on the internet interviews. However, I myself highly doubt Russia or China would be reluctant to agree with South Africa. Ukraine ousting a pro-Russian president and allowing killing of ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine were some of the reasons Putin cited for invading them. Uyghurs had fought with Chiang Kai-shek's fascist regime against Mao's communists, who later resorted to terrorist attacks. Finkelstein is a very smart guy, but he himself admits his intellectual expertise is very narrowly focused on Israel-Palestine. I'm definitely not an expert on China's history either, but I think if Russia or China had to defend their actions, they would probably have enough evidence and rationality to show their actions don't amount to ethnic cleansing or genocide. Israel, on the other hand, has zero chance of making the case they are not committing genocide. There are an overwhelming number of examples of disproportionality, disregard, and intent. The only way it won't is if judges in their countries were bought off. I would say it's more likely than not that the ICJ will agree with South Africa in at least deciding the case has merits. It is likely the United States and your administration will be implicated. I don't know if this has happened yet. I think there was something that they pointed towards in the United States recently, but this turned out to be right. All the judges from every country that had a position on the court, except for Uganda, the one most potentially bought off country, Uganda, and I think it was because they had a lot of Christians going there and influencing them and probably bribing the president with money and stuff like that. Pretty sure it was Uganda. All of them except for Uganda, the most bribable country, voted that the genocide case against Israel had merits and that it should at least go through a trial. So Israel's self-defense argument is not going to work. There are enough other examples in the West Bank of hundreds of killings. Doctors Without Borders cites 205 in 2023 before October 7th. If the ICJ does not find that Israel has been committing genocide, the result is going to be extremely bad. Israel will successfully expel Palestinians from Gaza quickly and gradually from the rest of the territories, and the issue will continue to be a point of contention that Islamic regimes will feed off of to keep sustaining themselves and foment endless intermittent periods of conflict for a very long time. You have to resolve this now. You have to agree Israel is genocidal. I know you guys have been saying the accusation is meritless. Say you are convinced by the evidence and change your mind. Here's the kicker. If you do affirm Israel is genocidal and Russia or China does not, then that is checkmate. You prove they are full of shit. If you do not, and they do, they will look even more like the morally superior ones. At minimum, you have to affirm that the case is plausible and should be subject to the full ICJ judicial proceedings. Again, the two-state solution is a bad idea. The reason China and the other Muslim states are pushing for it is because it would affirm their own regimes. You may think I have taken two contradicting stances when I say Ukraine should have relinquished territory to Russia and independence, but Israel-Palestine should not be relinquished to Jews as their own state. What is the difference between Russia fighting to accrue territory lived in by ethnic or cultural Russians and Israel trying to expand settlements and prevent Palestinians from having equal status to Jews? Part of the answer is you may be right. There may not be a difference. That is why I designed the strategy of offering to trade Ukraine territory Putin wanted independence for in exchange for Taiwan's independence. It was to gauge whether Russia actually had reasons for their actions and were willing to stick to those reasons. But the main difference is that religion is the worst reason. It is a non-reason, only meant to monopolize justifications. That is what the IDF means when they say they are the most moral army in the world, as they bomb numerous hospitals, their own designated safe zones, and a more than 90% civilian kill rate of 30,000 plus people. I know almost all, if not all of you in the Biden administration are Christian or Jewish. Biden and Austin are Catholic. Harris is a Baptist. Blinken is Jewish. Kirby is Catholic, I think. This is screwing up that other guy. Matt Miller, I think he's Catholic. This is screwing up your guys' ability to figure out these situations. I spent years debating professional and layman Catholics. I understand how you guys think, but there are major problems with your ability to anticipate others' actions, intentions, assess the potential of different options, and develop a moralistic framework that is realistic and widely acceptable. You guys really need my help. I want to help you if you haven't been able to tell yet. There are huge risks to screwing up this year. What I don't want is for your problems to get irredeemably worse. Even if you disagree with me, you still need my perspective to fill your blind spots. If you decide to actually pressure Israel in some way, you're going to need help dealing with the Republicans. Even though, as far as I can tell, you guys have screwed up considerably, they'd still be worse. You can't pussyfoot this. You have to go hard on all of them with an extreme amount of pressure and insistence that is actually backed up by reality. Besides, no matter how much you appease Israel, the conservatives and Zionists are not going to back you over Trump or whoever else their nominee is. Your only option is to clash with them. You need to be able to understand and explain exactly why your approach is the correct or better one, not this weak-ass non-answer shit that Blinken and Kirby mutter. Quote, we find the case brought by South Africa against Israel at the ICJ is without merit and counterproductive. Riveting. That's great, you guys. You're going to get smashed. So, and I just found out that Blinken had called China's treatment of the Uyghurs genocide. China is committing genocide, but Israel is not, huh? You guys are so fucking stupid. I got it. I figured it out. Okay. Now, I said this is obviously if I were president, how I would act. Like I said, that this is very complicated, and obviously I didn't expect Biden to really be able to pull this off. But I intended it to get him to nudge him, to try to start nudging him, or Kamala Harris, in the better direction. Because it's obviously not just because Biden's old, but he's and he's a Zionist and all that. He's been ingrained in his mentality. He's very locked in. He's very clearly not flexible. I guess it's not just because he's old, but it's partly because he's Catholic. Okay, well, anyways. I figured out what I'm trying to say. No, not that you guys are stupid. Israel is not on our side because they don't need us. I think besides the fact your inclination is to support Israel because you're a bunch of stupid Catholics and Jews, you are under the impression that either that your support is so critical for Israel that they are threatened without us, or that for reasons unbeknownst to me, their geostrategic foothold is vital for us. Now, obviously, the biggest reason is probably because of the Holocaust, that a lot of people feel sorry and are very wary of going through something like that. But it's more complicated than that. Most of it is really just Christians who base their religious ideas off of Judaism. And there's an alliance now, like I've been saying, between the religious conservatives and liberals, because liberals are targeting all of them as problems to different degrees. And actually, I'll get to it after I finish this. I only have 2 more. 65 out of 66. The problem is that Israel is not really threatened by Russia or China. Russia and China have enough sway over the Islamic countries, especially with our pressure added, that Israel won't actually ever be attacked by any of them. Not really. I mean, yeah, Iran has sent some missiles, but none of them actually really did any damage. Plus, more recently, as I've been trying to argue, the Islamic countries now know their existence is tied to Israel's existence. If Israel was actually erased from the map, they would follow. Plus, their religiously conservative mentalities are aligned with each other, especially against liberalism. A two-state solution is a very generous offer being made to Israel by Saudi Arabia, Iran, China, and the rest, who have mentioned it recently, mostly offered because it would again validate their own regimes while dealing a moral blow to the West. A morale slash moral blow to the West. The Islamic countries do not want Israel gone. They need Israel maintained as a recurring issue to bolster their regime support, just like how Netanyahu needs Iran's nuclear status to be a recurring issue. Also, think again about how Netanyahu opened his stupid mouth recently, calling how Turkey treated the Kurds as genocide. He did it intentionally because he is helping Russia, China, et al. Make us look really bad via the obvious parallels between Netanyahu and Erdogan's actions and the fact that we enable both situations. He does not feel the pressure of our declining moral standing because he is not tied with us and does not feel the pressure of how what he is doing is labeled. There is the possibility that October 7th was set up. The failure of the IDF to respond to the attack could have been enabled by an intentional oversight. Netanyahu moving forces from Gaza to the West Bank could have been an intentional opening. I don't think it is a coincidence that both Russia, Ukraine, and Israel-Gaza happened on your watch. They look very planned to hamstring you. There probably isn't any evidence for this besides the IDF's gross failure, but is definitely within Netanyahu's personality. I actually forgot to mention that Egypt actually warned Israel that Hamas was planning something. Egypt warned Israel even 3 days before. I think it was actually several months before. Egypt warned Israel days before Hamas struck, U.S. committee chairman says. Absolutely false. We know that Egypt has warned the Israelis 3 days prior to an event like this could happen. And Egypt confirmed this. We have warned them that an explosion of the situation is coming and very soon. It would be big, but they underestimated such warnings, said the official who spoke on condition of anonymity. The Cairo official said Israeli officials had played down the threat from Gaza, instead focusing on the West Bank. So there's that. I would not put it past them that they intentionally left themselves open for an attack. so they could have this justification to basically annihilate a bunch of Gaza, kill a bunch of people, and expand their settlements and have the justification to basically do what they want, expand their territory. I didn't even know until a news documentary. I didn't even know until a news documentary came out recently that when Netanyahu first ran for prime minister after his words probably got Yitzhak Rabin assassinated, his campaign was saved after a few suicide bomb-bust terrorist attacks. He personally knows the value of a terrorist attack. Conversely, he knows the value to Iran's regime that his threats have. They are colluding on some level for sure. At this point, defunding Israel and or pressuring for a two-state solution are not enough. You have an opportunity with South Africa's genocide case. It is being handed to you on a silver platter. You have to not just acquiesce to it. You have to push for it. Take it like Thor takes Mjolnir or Aragorn takes Anduril and smash them with it coldly. It would also be good if you get the global South on your side. And I just heard Biden say we don't support Taiwan independence. But we will defend them if China attacks. So he said we'll defend Taiwan. Biden says U.S. forces will defend Taiwan in the event of China attacks. This was before. And then recently, what did he say? But then Biden does not support Taiwan independence. U.S. does not support Taiwan independence. So we'll defend them if China attacks them, but we don't support their independence. You guys are all over the place. You need to get me to help you now. Whatever, I'm doing my own shit. I don't need to work in the State Department. I'll be president next anyways. After Kamala. Anyways, what was I going to say? I was going to expand on... Oh, yeah, so it's hard to say. I mean, I told all this to Kamala and Biden, and obviously, again, Joe Biden was Zionist, is Zionist, he's Catholic, is Christian. He was pretty hard-headed, very not flexible. But even if, I think Kamala probably is, obviously is and does have more concern for like Palestinians and everything in this situation. But even if she did want to take a drastically different course, obviously the election and how complicated the situation is and the inability for most people to understand the real depth of what's going on and try to be able to see, assess the situation accurately. It's very difficult for them, at least people like them with their personalities, to take the kind of stance that I'm urging, the very insistent stance that I do. I could handle it. Obviously, I'm very good at this stuff, and I can handle people's complaints or contradictions very easily. I'm extremely good at it. So I would be able to pull off something like this, but I think part of it is that they just don't have the training or the capability or experience to actually do something like that. But largely why I thought this was important, obviously, is because people need to be aware that a big part of the reason why this is yes, because they are trying to manipulate our election. That all this stuff about, Israel making Biden look weak and like a fool, or just disregarding Netanyahu, just disregarding things that he say, and supporting Ukraine into just this stalemate. All this done, and that's just these wars that are just continuing perpetuating, and they wouldn't have happened under Trump. And yeah, they probably wouldn't have happened under Trump. It's because Trump was extremely treasonous. Oh yeah, I didn't even know when I made that list of stuff Trump did that is only explained by him being bought off, by him being corrupted. All this stuff like recognizing Hong Kong as part of Taiwan, and assassinating Soleimani and letting bin Salman off the hook. I didn't even know about the recent thing of Egypt most likely bribing Trump. Egypt bribe Trump. Oversight. Donald Trump's alleged acceptance of Egyptian funds. This was not just Democrats pointing. This was an internal investigation during Trump's presidency that I think it was, I don't know if it was FBI. I think it was the FBI or the DOJ, Department of Justice. They were investigating themselves until Bill Barr crushed it. What was this guy's name? Egyptian for Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. I forget his name. But apparently there was reports from, I guess, agents or spies or something who said that there was a deal made. There was like a verbal deal made that Abdel al-Sisi will give Trump $10 million for something. And then they see Abdel al-Sisi withdraw $10 million from an Egyptian account. And then they see Trump inject $10 million into his campaign. 2016. This was 2016 while he was running. And then once he gets in office, he does a bunch of stuff that favored Abdel al-Sisi. And so this was an investigation that had a lot of smoke to it, where there's smoke, there's fire kind of thing. But that fucking bastard Bill Barr just stopped it. He said, no, you're not continuing with this. And then apparently there's some sort of statute of limitations or something that it can't be investigated after a certain period of time or some shit. And I didn't even know about this. And the point with that about Trump being corrupt is that it's basically a probability thing. Even when you don't have, receipts and direct evidence, you can still say, all right, well, the only explanation for him to act this way is if he was getting something out of it. All right, I'm going to cut off. I start rambling on a bit. I can talk more about this kind of stuff later at some point. The next videos, I'm going to finish the next Final Fantasy VII Rebirth theory video I'm working on. It's only about like a 16, 17 minute long video. But it was made to tie into this kind of stuff more clearly from my first two videos that I have public on rebirth theories. But thanks for watching this, listening to the story, my writing, my letter to the presidents. And elections in a few days. So